My speech will start in 3, 2, and 1. There are two things that all teams need to pay attention to in this debate. First of all, is this conditioning beneficial or harmful for countries involved in the UNFCCC? And ensure that the standard of the Paris Agreement is high and will be met on time. The focus of this debate is not on whether countries will have the capability to actually fulfill their NDCs, because we believe that number one, NDCs, they are basically written promises by countries to adhere to the Paris Agreement, and saying that they can either not comply or they will just intentionally set their NDC really low is very flawed and unreasonable coming from opposition. And in the rebuttals, we will prove to you why this is very flawed and unreasonable. On CG, what we'll prove to you is exclusive. Number one, we think that under the terms of the development loan being conditioned based on countries' compliance, countries, they will take the Paris Agreement seriously. And it's kind of like a tool for countries to be aware of the urgency of the Paris Agreement. And number two, we're going to talk about the urgency of the Paris Agreement and how it will be more strengthened under the motion. So first of all, a couple of reframing, because what does this motion necessarily mean? Since OG did not do a very good job at reframing the motion, and so first of all, we believe that development loans, they will be given to countries who comply effectively and efficiently with their NDCs. We are emphasizing on the word effectively and efficiently. And the way this works is really simple. Hardworking countries will be rewarded. For example, if you just give out development loans to countries who hasn't really complied, because development loans are loans to help countries, for example, infrastructure, build roads, hospitals, and other stuff. And climate disaster destroyed these altogether. So this basically wastes money from organizations and will burden the country with more pollution or disasters afterwards. And for developing nations, because on they make a comparative about how it's just a small percentage that are changing and it's not effective enough. However, we believe that developing nations contribute the least amount of environmental damage, specifically because they have the least amount of industrialization. And it's still fair for us to have low rates of growth because they are not the one who make a lot of environmental damages. And we're not actually forcing countries to be fully environmentally sustainable at a fast pace, but rather we are making sure that countries who signed the Paris Agreement are aligned to move towards that goal. And now we'll move on to the responses for OO. First of all, OO talks about how country will set a really low NDC to meet it easily. However, we do not understand how low are they talking about. This is global cooperation, right? Countries cannot just simply delay their progress. Countries have to document their progress in detail and present it to the conference. If they fail to do so, there will be consequences. And even though countries can set their own NDC, it also have to comply with the timeline of the Paris Agreement. Because the NDC mandates that you have to make your NDC succeeding iterations be higher, so eventually you'll get to the point where you're moving towards a better goal where you're not sacrificing your economy altogether. And you also talk about how first world countries, they do not suffer anything while developing do. However, this debate is not the solution to basically hold first world countries accountable, as development loans are not something they even need to access. So it's necessarily doesn't harm them that much. But the thing here is that they basically outsource their pollution to third world countries, right? We already explained above why those developing nations are not the one with the most pollution. It is the developed nations who has. So when the third world is unable to access loans without changing their industrialization patterns, the people who suffer are countries who cannot offload those industries anymore. That is to say that this will be posed as something that countries should be responsible, and if they have problems, they should be documenting it in detail to the conference. So our argument, what we're trying to prove is really simple. How the Paris Agreement will be strengthened, and this gives countries the incentives to build their reputation. The premise here is that the problem with countries around the world nowadays is that there are a lot of goals being made, but progress is really slow. For instance, the SDG, right? Critics have been asking whether the world will ever be able to accomplish the SDG. The Paris Agreement is also really urgent, and this framework requires countries to cooperate effectively to meet the timeline. It's not just about you making your NDC really low, making 1% a year or 2 years without any progress. You will be kicked out, I'm sure about that. And also, this will create incentives for countries to develop their infrastructure more environmentally friendly, and this will build a system where countries, they prioritize green technology. Here's the worst case scenario, because even if countries don't have development loans, this will basically force them to think wisely on how they should spend their resources. There'll be more opportunity to really maximize their resources. So it's not about how countries cannot receive this, they'll be at a disadvantage. It's all about using your resources wisely. And we believe that this is being filtered because this basically built reputation for countries that constantly break NDCs. And this will even enhance the standard of the Paris Agreement, because we all want countries to constantly do well on what they have promised. So process will be more stringent moving forward. This also hinges on the urgency of the Paris Agreement too, because under this condition, like development loans will be conditioned based on your compliance of your NDCs. So this is basically a tool to make this happen more efficiently and more effectively. It's not excluding countries, but rather we are basically building a future where the environment is not in danger. The impact here is pretty obvious, as we must say, because under this condition being implied, or under this motion, we believe that countries will have the incentive to work harder. And any point pointed out by opposition about how countries will take advantage of this, to just take the development loan, no longer stand in this debate, as we have done enough to prove to you why. And reasons why we take over OG is because we're able to prove to you a more nuanced case on how countries will take responsibility, while they only focus on how countries can get the loan themselves. And very proud to propose. Thank you.